Hey, welcome back to Infogamer. For this video, we're going to continue on with our Photon tutorials. In the last video, I showed you how to create a delay start matchmaking system. And in this video, we want to show you how to create a custom matchmaking system. Now, a custom matchmaking system is where you first have to join a Photon lobby. And once you're inside that lobby, you'll see a list of all the available rooms. Once you join a room, you'll then see a list of all the current players within that room. Once enough players have joined the room, the master client can then click a start button, which will load all the players into the multiplayer scene and start the game. Now, I've shown how to create a custom matchmaking system in a previous tutorial series, but that process took me 3 videos in order to create this functionality. For this series, I'm trying to do everything a lot more concise, so we're going to try and create this custom matchmaking system in one video, and I'll also provide all of the code for this video on our website, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Alright, so first things first, I'd like to demonstrate this custom matchmaking system to show you how it works. So I'm going to click play in the editor. Now the first thing that you'll notice is that we have this input field, which is for changing the local player's name. And so I'm going to change my name to Nate. We then have this custom matchmaking button, which when clicked will connect us to a Photon lobby. From here, I'm then going to open up a standalone build of my project, and I'm going to click the custom matchmaking button. The next thing that you'll notice is that over on the left-hand side, we have 2 input fields for creating new rooms. The first input field is for the room name, and the second input field is for the room size. And so I'm going to type in test room, and we're going to make it a room size of 4. I'm then going to click create. Now, a couple of things have happened here. In our standalone build, we're no longer in the lobby, but instead we're in a room. And we have one player in our room, which is our local player called player 388. We then have the name of our room over here on the left-hand side, and we have a start button and a leave button. In our editor, we now have one room listing in our lobby, which is the test room, and there is 1 player out of 4 currently in this room. And so if I click on this room listing, it'll actually connect me to that room. And so now we have 2 players in this room, our test room. Now the biggest difference between the client who created the room and the client who joined the room is our start button. The start button is only active for the master client. Now when we have enough players loaded into our room, our master client can click the start button, and that'll load both players into the multiplayer scene. And when we go to our hierarchy, you can see that we have 2 Photon player objects. Now there's a couple additional features that I've added into this custom matchmaking system, but to save on time, I'm not going to be able to demonstrate all of them. So let's get on with the creation of this custom matchmaking system. So to get started, I have this custom matchmaking menu demo scene, and let's first walk through all the objects that make up this scene. First up, we have our main camera and our directional light. We then have the network controller game object that we created in the very first video of this tutorial series. So if you don't have this object, then make sure that you watch that video and then come back to this one. The next object is the lobby controller for our custom matchmaking system. This is just an empty game object with a new script attached, and we'll talk about this script in a little bit. We then have the room controller for our custom matchmaking system, and once again, this is just an empty game object with a new script attached to it. Next up, let's walk through our canvas game object. Inside this canvas game object, we have 3 child game objects, which are UI panels. Our first one is the custom matchmaking menu panel. The next one is our lobby panel, and the last one is our room panel. So let's talk about the custom matchmaking menu. On this panel, we have a text object, which is for our title, which is this Infogamer custom matchmaking. We then have our player name input, which is this input field where the players can enter in their name. Next up, we have our loading button, which is this grayed out button right here. This is just an ordinary UI button that I've changed the text on to say loading. And then I've also turned off the interactable option for the button component. We then have our join lobby button, which is this button right here that says custom matchmaking. And for this button, all we need to do is make sure that we turn it off in the hierarchy. So that's everything that we need for our menu panel. Now let's switch over to our lobby panel. Inside the lobby panel, I also have a text object which says Infogamer-lobby. I then have our name input field and our size input field, which are these two input fields right here. I then have a button for our create room, and I have a back button to go back to the menu. Next up, we have our room scroll rect, which is this white box right here. This is just a UI image that I've also attached a scroll rect component and a mask component to. For the scroll rect component, I've set that to the next child object, which we'll talk about in a second, and I've also turned off the horizontal scroll. We then need to create this rooms container object, which is a child to our scroll rect, and this is just another UI image that I've attached a vertical layout group to. You'll also notice how the UI image extends down below our scroll rect, and if I turn off the mask of our scroll rect, you'll then be able to see the actual size of our rooms container game object. So that's everything that we need for this lobby panel. Now let's switch over to the room panel. On this room panel, we have another text object, which is this infogamer-room. We then have another text object, which is for the room name. We then have a button for starting the game, which I've disabled in the hierarchy, but it's this button right here. And we have another button for going back to the lobby, which is this leave button right here. And the last object that we have within our scene is our event system. But now what I'm going to do is reset everything back to the way it needs to be when we first play our game. So I'm going to disable our room panel in the hierarchy. And I'm going to re-enable our custom matchmaking menu object. So now that we've gone through all the objects that make up this scene, let's talk about the scripts that we'll need for our custom matchmaking system. You'll need 3 scripts. The first one is our custom matchmaking lobby controller. The next one is our custom matchmaking room controller. And the last one is what I've called room button. So let's go ahead and open these scripts up in our coding environment. So first up, we have our custom matchmaking lobby controller. And the first thing that we need to do is add some namespaces up at the top. And these are the namespaces that I'm using. I have using photon.pun, using photon.realtime, using system.collections.generic, using Unity Engine, and finally using Unity Engine.ui. We then need to make sure that we're inheriting this class from monobehavior PUN callbacks. The next thing that we need are some variables, and for this script we have quite a few, and so let's just go through them real quick. The first 3 variables are private game objects, which I've made all serialized fields so that we can set them in the inspector. The first one is called lobby connect button. The next one is our lobby panel, and the last one is our menu panel. The next variable is a private input field, which is also a serialized field, and this one is called player name input. The next variable is a private string called room name, and we don't need to make this a serialized field. The next one is a private int called room size. The next variable is a private list of type room info, and this is called room listings. The next variable is a private transform, which is also a serialized field, and it's called rooms container. And the last variable is a private game object, which is also a serialized field, and I've called this room listing prefab. Once we have all these variables, the next thing that we need to do is create our callback function for when we first connect to the Photon servers. This is a public override void function, which is called onConnectToMaster, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way. Inside this function, the first thing that we're doing is setting our automatically sync scene equal to true. So I have photon network.automatically sync scene equals true. This will make it so that whenever the master client calls photon network.load scene, all of the clients will load into the same scene as the master client. On the next line of code, once we've connected to Photon server, we want to enable our lobby connect button. So we have lobby connect button.setActive, and we're passing in true. On the next line of code, we're initializing our room listings variable by setting it equal to new list of type room info. The next part of this function is for setting up the player's name across the Photon network. To do this, we first want to check to see if we've saved a value to our player prefs. And so I'm checking to see if player prefs has the key nickname. If we've already set this key, then there's a possibility that the value is an empty string. And so in this if statement, we're checking to see if playerprefs.getString, and we're passing in nickname, is equal to this empty string. If this is the case, then we want to randomize a value for the player's name. And so here I have photonnetwork.nickname equals player plus random.range, and we're passing in 0 and 1000. Next, we have this else statement for if the string value is not an empty string. If it's not an empty string, then we just want to call photonnetwork.nickname equals playerprefs.getString, and we're going to pass in nickname. Next, we need to create this else statement for this if statement, which means that the nickname key does not exist in our player prefs. If it does not exist, then we're going to be doing the same thing that we've done on this line inside this else statement. And the last thing that we need to do for this function is update the text value of our player name input field so that it reads our player's name. And to do this, we have player name input.text equals photonnetwork.nickname. The next thing that we need to do is create a public function that we can pair to our player name input field, and that way when a player types a new name, it will save that name in our player prefs. So here I have this public void function which I've called player name update. For this function we need one parameter which is of type string, and I've called it name input. Inside this function we need to call photonnetwork.nickname and set it equal to name input. We then need to set our player prefs, so I have playerprefs.setString. We need to pass in the key value, which is nickname, and then we pass in our name input. And that'll actually do it for this function. We don't need this last line of code because that's just being redundant. The next thing that we need to do is create a public function that we can pair to the join lobby button. And so here I have this public void function which I've called join lobby on click. Inside this function we want to disable our main menu panel, so I have main panel.setActive and I'm passing in false. We then want to enable our lobby panel, so I have lobby panel.setActive and I'm passing in true. And lastly, we want to join a Photon lobby, and so I'm calling the photonnetwork.joinLobby function. Now once we join a lobby, we can start receiving updates on all the rooms in that lobby. And to do this, we need this callback function, which is a public override void function, and it's called onRoomListUpdate, and it needs to be spelled exactly this way. The parameter of this function is a list of type roomInfo, and it's called roomList. Inside this function, the first thing that we need to do is create a local variable which is of type int, and I've called it tempIndex. The next thing that we need to do is for loop through each element in our room list, and so I'm using this for each loop, where we want to look at each room info called room in our room list, which is a list of room infos. Inside this loop, the first thing that we want to do is check to see if room listings does not equal null. The room listings variable is our own list of room info, and this is where we're going to be caching the list of rooms that we received from this callback function. Inside this if statement, we need to check to see if the current room we're looking at in our for each loop exists within our room listings. If it does, then we want to get the index of it and save it into our tempIndex variable. And so to do this, we have tempIndex equals roomlistings.findIndex, and then we're using this function, which is what's called a predicate function. This function is called by name, and we're passing in room, which is our current room, .name. Now let's scroll down and I'll show you how to create this predicate function. Now to briefly explain what a predicate function is, I'm going to reference back to my past self. Now in simple terms, a predicate is a way to reference a more complex class, in this case room info, by using one of its more basic member variables, such as name, to identify it. And so once again, we're using this predicate function to pass in a string value, which is the name of our current room, and we're using that value to be the identifier for the entire room info value. And so we use this identifier to see if we have a match when comparing two different room infos. Now for this predicate function, we have static system.predicate, and we're looking for room info. We then give this function a name, which is by name, and our parameter is a string called name. Inside this function, we have return delegate, and then parentheses room info room. Inside this delegate, we have return room.name, equals name. So once you have this predicate function, we can then scroll back up to our onRoomListUpdate function. The next thing that we need to do is create this else statement for if our room listing does equal null. If it does equal null, then we want to set our temp index equal to -1. We then have an if statement where we're checking to see if temp index does not equal -1. If it does not equal -1, then it means that this current room already exists. And so we have room listing.removeAt. We then want to pass in the temp index. We then want to destroy the actual game object for this room listing. And so we have destroy. Then we're calling room container.getChild. We're passing in temp index, and then we want the game object. The next thing that we need to do after this is check to see if our current room has a player count greater than 0. If it has a player count greater than 0, then it means that this room is still open. And so we're going to recreate a room listing for this room with updated stats such as the player count. If the player count is less than or equal to 0, then it means that this room has closed, and so we don't want to recreate a room listing for it. So inside this if statement, we have roomListings.add, and then we're passing in room. I'm then calling a new function, which I've called listRoom, and we're passing in room. Now let's go to where we're creating this function, which is right here. This is a void function called listRoom. The parameter is a room info called room. Inside this function, we first want to check to see if room.isOpen is equal to true and room.isVisible is equal to true. If these are both true, then inside this if statement, we want to instantiate a new room listing. And so we have GameObject.tempListing equals instantiate room listing prefab, and then we want to pass in our room container as the parent. On the next line of code, we want to get the room button script from this game object that we instantiated. And so we have temp button equals temp listing dot get component, and we're looking for room button. On the next line of code, we want to call this public function, which belongs to our room button class. And we'll talk about this function in a second, but for this line, we have temp button dot set room, and we need to pass in 3 parameters. The first parameter is the room.name, second parameter is the room.maxPlayers, and the third parameter is room.playerCount. The next thing that we need to do is create 2 public functions that will pair to the input fields on our lobby panel. So the first one is public void function, which I've called onRoomNameChanged. This function needs a parameter which is of type string, and I've called it nameIn. Inside this function, we're setting our room name variable equal to nameIn. For the next function, this is a public void function, which is called onRoomSizeChanged. And for this function, we need a parameter which is also of type string called sizeIn. For inside this function, we need to set our room size equal to int.parse, and we're passing in room size. This will convert this string into an integer value. For the next function, we need to create a public function that we compare to the create room button. So this is a public void function, which I've called create room. Inside this function, we need to set up our room options. So I have room options.roomOps equals new room options, and then in curly braces we need to set the isVisible variable equal to true, the isOpen variable equal to true, and the max players equal to byte room size. On the last line of code for this function, we need to call Photon network.createRoom, and we need to pass in our room name and then our room ops. The next thing that we need to do is create this callback function for if we fail to create the room. And the number one reason for failing to create a room is that the name that we chose already exists. But for this callback function, this is a public override void function called onCreateRoomFailed, and it needs to be spelled exactly this way. The parameters of this function are a short called return code and a string called message. Now the only thing that I have within this function is a debug.log statement. Now if we wanted to, we could actually add some code to this function so that it would display an error message to the player instead of the console, but I'm not going to do that in this video. Now the last thing that we need to do for this script is create a public function that we can set to the onClick event for our cancel button located on our lobby panel. This is a public void function called Matchmaking Cancel. Inside this function I have mainPanel.setActive and I'm passing in true. I then have lobbyPanel.setActive and I'm passing in false. And then I have PhotonNetwork.leaveLobby. Once you have all of that, you can then save this script and we'll go over to our custom matchmaking room controller. For this script, we need to add some new namespaces up at the top. We have using photon.pun, using photon.realtime, using Unity Engine, using system.collections, and using unityengine.ui. We then need to make sure that we're inheriting this class from monobehavior PUN callbacks. The next thing that we need to do is add in some variables. The first variable is a private int, which I've made a serialized field, and I've called this multiplayer scene index. The next three variables are private game objects, which are also serialized fields. The first one is called lobby panel, the next one is called room panel, and the last one is called start button. The next variable is a private transform, which is also a serialized field, and this is for our player's container. The next one is private game object, which is also a serialized field, and this is for our player listings prefab. The last variable that we have is a private text variable, which I've made a serialized field, and this is called room name display. Once we have all these variables, we're first going to create some functions that will be helpful in this script. The first function is a void function, which I've called clear player listings. Inside this function, we want to for loop through each child object belonging to our player container object. So I have for int I equals player container dot child count minus 1. I then have I is greater than or equal to 0, and then I minus minus. Inside this for loop, we have destroy player container dot get child. We're passing in I as the index, and then dot game object. The next helpful function is this void function, which is called list players. Inside this function, we have a for each loop where we're looping through each player in our Photon network.player list. Inside this for each loop, we need to instantiate a player listing for each player. And so I have this local variable of type game object called temp listing, and I'm setting it equal to instantiate. The object that we're instantiating is player listing prefab, and we want to make it a child to our player's container. On the next line of code, we want to get the text object that is a child to this newly instantiated object. And so we have text, temp text equals temp listing dot transform dot get child, and we want the first index. I then have dot get component, and we're looking for a text component. On the next line of code, we want to update the text value so that it reads the player's name. And so I have temp text equals player.nickname. The next thing that we need to do is create a callback function for whenever we join a new room. And so I have this public override void function called onJoinedRoom, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way. Inside this function, we want to switch over to our room panel, and so I have room panel.setActive, and I'm passing in true. I then have lobbyPanel.setActive, and I'm passing in false. We can then update the text display for our room name, and so I have roomNameDisplay.text equals photonnetwork.currentroom.name. For the next part of this function, we need to check to see if we're the master client, and so I have if photonnetwork.isMasterClient. If we are the master client, then we want to enable the start button. And so I have startButton.setActive, and I'm passing in true. If we're not the master client, then we want to disable the start button. And so I have this else statement, and inside it I have startButton.setActive, and I'm passing in false. The next thing that we're going to do is clear all the player listings from our player's container, and we'll do that using the clear players listings function. And then we want to relist all the players with the new updates, and we'll do that by calling list players. The next thing that we need to do is create this callback function for when other players join our room. And so this is a public override void function called onPlayerEnterRoom. The parameter for this function is a player called newPlayer. Inside this function, I'm just calling our clear player listings function, and I'm calling our list players function. The next thing that we need to do is create this callback function for when a player leaves our room. And so I have public override void, and then onPlayerLeftRoom. The parameter for this function is a player called otherPlayer. Inside this function, we just need to do the same thing. We're going to call our clear player listings function, and then our list players function. But then we're going to do something a little bit different. We need to check to see if photonnetwork.isMasterClient is true. If we are the master client, then we want to enable our start button. And so I have startButton.setActive, and I'm passing in true. We need this if statement in the case of host migration, where the master client leaves the room and the next player becomes the master client. After all of these callback functions, the next thing that we need to do is create a public function that we compare to our start game button. So here I have public void start game. Inside this function, we need to check to see if we are the master client. If we are the master client, then we want to close the current room. And so I have photon network.currentRoom.isOpen, and I'm setting it equal to false. Now this will make it so that once our game is started, this room will no longer be listed in the lobby panel, which means that no new players can join this room. Now if you'd like to make your game more like Battlefield, where players can join an ongoing game, then all you have to do is comment out this line. On the next line of code, we're going to load into the multiplayer scene. And so I have photon network.loadLevel, and we're then passing in our multiplayer scene index. Now the next thing that we need to do is create this coroutine, which will help us in our next function. To create this coroutine, you need IEnumerator, and I've called this function rejoinLobby. Inside this coroutine, we just have yield return new, and then wait 4 seconds, and I'm passing in just 1 second. And then we have photon network.joinLobby. After this, we need to create a public function that we compare to the back button found in our room panel. So I have public void and then back on click. Inside this function, we have lobbyPanel.setActive, and we're passing in true. We then have roomPanel.setActive, and we're passing in false. I then have PhotonNetwork.leaveRoom. I then have PhotonNetwork.leaveLobby, and then I have start coroutine, and I'm passing in rejoin lobby. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because I was running into a problem whenever I was the master client and I was returning out of the game that I created back to the lobby window. When I would do that, I would not receive an updated list of all the available rooms in my lobby. So to fix this, we're disconnecting from the lobby and then rejoining it a second later. And when we rejoin the lobby, it'll then trigger the onRoomList update callback function. Now once you have all of this, we can then save this script and we'll go over to our room button script. Inside this script, we just need using photon.pun, using Unity Engine, and using Unity Engine.ui. For the variables in this script, we need 2 private text variables, which are both serialized fields. The first one is called nameText, and the second one is called sizeText. We then need a private string called roomName, and 2 private ints, one called roomSize and one called playerCount. We then need a public function that we compare to the button component of our room listings prefab. And so I have public void, and then this is our join room on click function. Inside this function, we're just calling photon network.joinRoom, and we're passing in room name. We then need to create the public function that we're calling within our lobby controller script right here. This is a public void function called setRoom, and there's 3 parameters for this function. The first one is a string called nameInput. The second one is an int called sizeInput. And the third one is an int called countInput. Inside this function, we're setting our room name variable equal to nameInput, our room size equal to sizeInput, and our player count equal to countInput. We then need to update our text values, and so we have nameText.text equals nameInput. We then have sizeText.text equals countInput, and then we're combining that with a string, which is just a slash, and we're also combining it with our size input. This will give us the number of players in our room out of the total possible players for our room. Once we have this, let's just go ahead and save all our scripts, and we'll go back to Unity. Inside Unity, the first thing that we need to do is select our lobby controller custom matchmaking game object, and then you're going to want to attach your lobby controller script to this game object in the inspector. We then need to set our variables, and for the lobby connect button, I've set that equal to this join lobby game object. For the lobby panel, I have that set to our lobby panel. For our main panel, I have that set to my custom matchmaking menu. For our player name input, I have that set to the player name input field. And for our room container, I have that set to our room container display game object, which is child to our room scroll wrapped. For our room listing prefab, we need to set it to this prefab, which I'll show you how to create. This prefab is just a UI button, which I've called room listing. And this button has 2 text game objects as child. One is called name and one is called size. The only other thing that we need for this prefab is that we need to attach the room button script to this game object. You'll then drag in the name text game object to the first variable and the size text game object to the second variable, and then we need to set the onClick event. And so we'll drag in the script to here, and then we'll use the drop-down menu to go to Room button, and we'll select Join Room on Click. Once you've created this game object, you can then drag it into your project window to save it as a prefab. So once you have your lobby controller created, let's select our room controller. For our room controller game object, we want to make sure that we attach our custom matchmaking room controller script, and then we need to set our variables. For the multiplayer scene index, we're going to set that to 1. For our lobby panel, we have that set to our lobby panel game object. For our room panel, we have that set to our room panel game object. For our start button, we have that set to our start button that's attached to our room panel. For our player container, I have that set to my player container display, which is a child to my player scroll rect. I'm going to skip the next variable and come back to it after we talk about the room name display, which is this text game object, which is for displaying the room name to the player. Once we have all of these variables created, we then need to create this prefab for our player listing. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to create that. This game object is just a UI image that I've named player listing, and it has one text game object as a child called player name. Once you have this game object created, you can then make it a prefab by dragging it into your project window. And once you have this prefab created, we then need to drag it into the room listings prefab variable of our room controller script. Now the next thing that we need to do is make sure that we set all the public functions for our UI objects. The first UI object that we need to set is our player name input field, and you need to set the onValueChange function. And so for this, you're going to click the plus sign and then drag in the lobby controller game object here. And then you're going to use the drop-down menu to select Custom Matchmaking Lobby Controller. And then up where it says Dynamic String up at the top, you want to select Player Name Update. We then want to select our Join Lobby button. You're going to click the plus sign for the onClick event and drag in the Lobby Controller game object here. You're then going to use the drop-down menu to go to Custom Matchmaking Lobby Controller and then select Join Lobby onClick. Next up, we have our name input field for creating a new room. For this, you want to scroll down to the onValueChange and click the plus sign. You're then going to drag in the Lobby Controller game object here, and then use the drop-down menu to go to Custom Matchmaking Lobby Controller, and then under Dynamic String, you're going to select On Room Name Changed. We're then going to do the same thing for the size input, but for this function, you want to select On Room Size Changed. We then need to select the Create button, and for this function, you want to select Create Room. We're then going to select the Back button, and for this function, we want to select Matchmaking Cancel. Now that's all the functions for the main menu panel and the lobby panel. Now all we have left is the room panel. And so for this, we're going to select the Start button. For this onClick event, instead of the lobby controller, we're going to drag in the room controller. And then for the function, we want to go to Custom Matchmaking Room Controller and select Start Game. For the back button, we're going to do the same thing, but for the function, we're going to select Back onClick. Now that should be everything that we need to do for this scene. The last thing that we need to do is make sure that we have a multiplayer scene. Now I showed you how to create a multiplayer scene in the last 2 videos, and so if you already have your multiplayer scene and your Photon player prefab, then you can go ahead and skip to this time here. But if you haven't watched those videos, then I'll show you how to create those things right now. So first off, we need to create a new scene, which I have right here, and I've named the scene Multiplayer Scene Demo. Inside the scene, all we have is our main camera and a directional light, and then an empty game object called Game Setup. Let's go ahead and look at this script in our coding environment. Inside the script, we first need to include some namespaces up at the top. The first one is using photon.pun. The next one is using system.io. And the last one is using Unity Engine. The next thing that we need to do is go inside our start function. And inside our start function, I'm calling this function here, which I've called create player. This function is a private void function. And inside this function, all we need to do is call photon network.instantiate. For the first parameter of this function, we need to pass in the file location for our Photon player prefab inside the resource folder. And so I have path.combined. and then I'm passing in two strings. The first string is going to be the folder that we're saving our Photon player prefab in, which I've called Photon Prefabs, and it needs to be spelled exactly like this. For the second string, I then have Photon player, which also needs to be spelled exactly like this. The second parameter of this function is going to be the position that we want to instantiate this object at, and so for this I just have vector3.0. And for the last parameter, we need the rotation. So I have quaternion.identity. Once you have this script, we can go ahead and save it, and then we'll go back to Unity. Back inside Unity, you just need to make sure that you attach your game setup script to this empty game object that we've created. Now let me show you how to create the Photon player prefab, which I have right here. This is just an empty game object, which I've named Photon player, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way as we have in our script right here. We then need to attach a Photon view to this object, and so we're going to use the Add Component drop-down menu, search Photon view, and it should be the first option. I've then also attached a capsule object to this empty game object so that we can see it within our scene. But you'll actually want to disable this capsule object when you're not testing your game. Once you have this Photon player object created, you'll then need to make it into a prefab. To do this, we need to create a new folder in our project window called Resources, and then you also need to create another folder inside your Resources folder called Photon Prefabs, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way that we have in our script right here. Once you have these folders created, you'll then need to select your Photon player object and drag it into your project window. Once you've made this into a prefab, you can then remove it from your hierarchy, and we'll save this scene. Alright, so once you have your multiplayer scene and your Photon player prefab, the last thing that we need to do before we can test this project is make sure that we have our build order set up. So I'm going to go to File, Build Settings, and here you can see my build order. I have my custom matchmaking menu demo as the first scene, and I have my multiplayer scene demo as the second scene. Once you have this, we can then build our project, and I'll demonstrate it one more time. Alright, so here I have my game, and I'm going to click the custom matchmaking button, which will load me into the lobby. And then I'm going to open up my standalone, and I'm going to click that same button. Then here in the standalone, I'm going to set the name of my new room, and I'll just set it to ABC. And then I'm going to set the room size. We'll set it to something bigger, like 10. And then I'm going to click Create. And so here in my standalone, you can see that it's connected me to my room. And in the editor, you can see that we have that room listed in the lobby. If I click on that room, it'll then connect my editor to that room, and now we have two players in the room. Now at this point in time, I could leave the room as the master client, and that'll take me back to the lobby window, and here you can see that it's reloaded the ABC room, and it's removed that player from the room in my editor. You can also see that now I have a start button in my editor, and if I rejoin that room from my standalone, I don't have a start button over here anymore. And then I can click Start in my editor, and that'll load me into the multiplayer scene. Alright, so that's everything that we're going to cover in this video on how to create a custom matchmaking system in Unity using the Photon plugin. Now remember, you can find all of the code for this video on our website at infogamerhub.com. We will also provide this custom matchmaking system as a Photon add-on that you can download for free off of our website as well. I'll leave links to both of those pages in the description below. Now I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave them in the comments below or join our Discord server. And finally, make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.